living out of a duffel bag in a small rural town for a short-term assignment, logistical, procedural, the kind of work that's mostly checklists and documentation. During the day, I drove between sites with a clipboard on the passenger seat and a thermos in the cup holder, photographing equipment tags, noting serial numbers, measuring clearances, filing reports that nobody would read unless something went wrong. The town fit the job. Tree-lined streets, neat yards, modest storefronts with faded signs, closing early like they were tired. I liked that nothing tried to entertain me. I kept to myself, cooked simple dinners, reviewed my notes, and went to bed early. If you want more true-feeling accounts like this, subscribe and I'll keep telling them the way I remember them. The assignment was supposed to run a few weeks, long enough that it made sense to rent a small place instead of bouncing between motels. The rental sat near the center of town, modest but clean, the kind of house that smelled faintly of old pine and laundry detergent no matter how often you opened the windows. There was a tiny porch, a gravel driveway, and an empty lot on one side that had been mowed recently. The work sometimes pushed late, an inspection that ran long, a contractor who insisted we finish up while we're here, paperwork that had to be submitted before morning. Within the first few days I noticed how early everything closed. The diner flipped its sign to close before the sky had even gone fully dark. The hardware store locked up while commuters in bigger towns would still be on the road. Then I saw the notice. It was posted near the rental property, tucked under a plastic cover like a weatherproof menu. A night curfew, written as a local ordinance. Official language, plain formatting, but strangely vague. No explanation, no list of penalties, no number to call. Just the time and a firm instruction to be indoors. I assumed it was small-town caution, wildlife, past vandalism, understaffed police. A quirk. Something you follow the way you follow a no parking sign, even when the street is empty. The first time I brushed up against it was unremarkable on paper. I'd stayed at a site later than usual, then stopped to pick up groceries, thinking I'd be quick. By the time I turned back toward the rental, the town felt like it had been folded away. It wasn't just that people were inside. Porch lights were off. Cars were gone from the curb. Even the usual background noise had dropped out. No distant traffic. No dogs. The insects that had been loud in the hedges the night before were quiet, as if someone had turned down the volume on the whole place. The curfew time passed without a siren or patrol car. Nothing announced it. And still, the silence felt deliberate, like the town had practiced it. I noticed a couple houses with interior lights on, but no shadows moving behind curtains. I had that prickling sense of being watched without seeing anyone doing the watching. I locked my door, told myself I was tired and unfamiliar with the rhythms here, and went about my evening as normally as I could. After that, I started noticing patterns the way you notice a headache coming on, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore once you know what to look for. Each night, about 15 minutes before the posted time, outdoor activity stopped entirely. If someone was walking a dog, they turned back. If a car was driving, it pulled into a driveway. It happened too cleanly to be coincidence, like a rehearsal everyone remembered. Some streetlights dimmed or shut off in certain pockets, but not in a consistent pattern I could map. One block would glow like normal, the next would be washed in a thinner, colder light. From my porch I could see down to the intersection, and I started watching it without meaning to, spoon halfway to my mouth, waiting to see what would change. And then there were the sounds. Not dramatic. Not a scream. Not breaking glass. Just faint things like the town settling but with an intent behind it. Slow footsteps on pavement that didn't hurry. A distant metallic scrape, not like an accident, more like something being dragged carefully and then stopped. Sometimes something brushed along the fence line beside the empty lot, soft and steady, as if someone's sleeve or coat kept catching the wood. When I looked out the windows, there was nothing. No shapes under the streetlights. No movement in the yards. If I opened the door a crack, the air outside felt colder than it should have, and the quiet pressed closer, so I'd close it again. My phone signal became unreliable at night. During the day it worked fine. After curfew it would drop a bar, then another, then hover on a single thin line as if it didn't want to connect. Once trying to load a simple weather page, it just spun and spun until I gave up. I started noticing small changes that made my stomach tighten without giving me proof. A door on a nearby building that had been firmly shut earlier was now slightly ajar. A trash bin at the edge of someone's driveway turned at an odd angle like it had been nudged, but nobody was outside to have nudged it. It didn't feel like someone was doing things to scare me. It felt like nighttime here had its own traffic, its own routines, quiet, orderly, and not meant for witnesses. The shift in me wasn't a single moment of panic. It was a slow acceptance that what I was feeling wasn't the usual fear of being attacked. It was something closer to the feeling of walking into a room where you're not welcome and realizing everyone already knows you shouldn't be there. One night I stood in the kitchen with the overhead light on and felt suddenly exposed, as if the glow was a signal. I turned it off and moved more quietly without deciding to. I avoided stepping on the creaky board near the hallway. I kept my phone screen dim. When I crossed the living room, I didn't walk straight across. I hugged the wall like it mattered. I understood, in a calm and sickening way, that the curfew wasn't for safety. It was a boundary, and whatever came with the boundary didn't want to be acknowledged. I told myself I was overreacting, that I'd been working too much and sleeping too lightly. But my body didn't believe my explanations. My chest carried a steady tension, like I was holding my breath without meaning to. If you're the kind of listener who appreciates slow burn, realistic horror, a quiet like goes a long way. The night it nearly went wrong started as an ordinary problem, a delay I couldn't control. A contractor's paperwork didn't match the site conditions, and we had to recheck measurements. By the time we finished, the light was already thinning into that flat gray that comes before early dark. I drove back toward town with my headlights on sooner than I liked, watching the sky fade through bare branches. I knew I'd missed the posted time. I told myself it was only a rule, and rules have exceptions. I kept the radio low, not for focus, but because sound felt wrong. As I entered town, the streets were empty in that same practiced way, but it didn't feel like everyone had simply gone home. It felt staged. The storefronts were dark, the diner sign unlit, the intersection lights cycling for nobody. Halfway to the rental, something moved at the edge of my headlights. Not a deer. Not a cat. It wasn't fast. It wasn't panicked. It crossed the beam with a slow confidence, like it knew I would slow down. I did. The tires crunched softly over the road grit as I eased off the gas. My eyes tried to make sense of what I'd seen, an outline that didn't sharpen into anything familiar. The moment I leaned forward, as if trying to catch it visually, it was gone, not in a sprint, but in the same quiet way the town's noises disappeared after curfew. I drove the rest of the way, like I was following instructions I couldn't hear. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, the beam of my headlights swept over the yard and landed on small things that were wrong. The gravel looked disturbed in a shallow arc near the porch steps, as if something heavy had shifted there recently. The welcome mat was crooked, just slightly, but I was careful about that kind of thing. I always straightened it when I came in, almost unconsciously. Near the doorframe, low down, there were faint marks in the paint that hadn't been there before, thin and parallel, like something had tested the surface. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine running, hands still on the steering wheel. The house looked normal. Dark windows, quiet porch, but the feeling that it was occupied, already aware of me, settled into my gut with the certainty of bad weather. I turned off the engine. The silence rushed in. I didn't turn on the porch light. I walked up the steps carefully, as if stepping too hard would be a message. My key sounded too loud in the lock. When the door opened, the air inside felt stale, like it had been closed up for days, even though I'd left that morning. I went in and locked it behind me without clicking the deadbolt too hard. I left the lights off. The faint glow from the street was enough to outline the furniture in low gray shapes. Then I heard it, movement outside the wall, close enough that I could tell it was slow and deliberate. Not a stumble. Not a random animal in a hurry. It moved along the siding, pausing, then continuing, as if it was tracing the house. Once, something made a soft contact sound, would against something firmer, then silence again. I stood in the hallway with my back against the wall, feeling my pulse in my throat, trying not to breathe too loudly. The worst part was that nothing escalated into the kind of danger you can react to. No handle jiggled. No glass cracked. No pounding. It felt like a test. Like something outside was waiting for me to do the human thing. Turn on a light, look out, announce myself, prove I was awake and present. And I understood, with a cold clarity, that being seen wasn't the risk. Acknowledging it was. So I stayed still. I kept my eyes off the windows. I didn't reach for my phone. I let the minutes stretch until time stopped feeling measured and started feeling like pressure. Eventually the movement drifted away, not retreating, just moving on. The silence didn't lift. It simply repositioned itself elsewhere, like a weight shifting on a bed. I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair in the dark until the edges of the windows began to lighten with morning. At sunrise, the town returned as if nothing had happened. Cars appeared in driveways. A couple jogged past my street in matching hoodies. The diner opened, lights bright, the smell of coffee drifting faintly in the cool air. People moved with that calm rural pace, nodding politely if you made eye contact. I walked outside and checked the porch, the gravel, the doorframe. Nothing looked definitive in daylight. The disturbed gravel could have been from my own tires. The marks near the door could have been old scuffs I'd never noticed. The mat sat straight, as if it had always been. Later, I tried to look up the curfew ordinance online. I searched the town's site, the county listings, archived PDFs. Nothing. No mention. No record. The notice I'd seen posted felt suddenly impossible, like something you dreamed and then couldn't prove when you woke up. I adjusted my routine immediately. Not as a decision I weighed, but as a reflex. I made sure I was indoors well before dusk. I finished my work faster than planned. I kept my bag packed, the way you do when you don't want to admit you're ready to leave at any moment. In the last days of the assignment, the small details kept scraping at me. One evening I noticed the exterior light above the back door looked newer. Clean plastic, no yellowing, though I'd never requested maintenance. A trash bin by the curb was shifted a few inches when I woke up, subtle but consistent, like someone had moved it and tried to put it back exactly. I'd set up a cheap security camera inside facing the living room window, not because I thought it would catch anything dramatic, but because I wanted proof that I wasn't imagining the gaps in my memory. During the day it recorded fine. At night, during curfew hours, there were clean breaks in the footage. Not blurry motion events. Not power loss. Just missing time, as if the recorder had politely looked away. I drove around once with a paper map from the rental's drawer and realized it didn't match the town as I'd come to know it. Streets labeled one way, but laid out differently. A dead end shown where I'd been driving through all week. The online maps weren't much better. Outdated business listings, missing alleys, odd blank spaces where the empty lot sat. What bothered me most was how nobody ever spoke about the curfew. Not a warning, not a joke, not a complaint. It was only posted, implied, and obeyed. And whatever enforced it didn't need uniforms. Years later, I still think about that town in a way that doesn't feel like nostalgia or fear, more like a memory of learning a rule you didn't know existed. There were no news stories, no forum posts, no local legends I could find. On paper, my assignment happened like any other, receipts, reports, mileage logs. But the experience sits isolated in my mind, like something I'm not supposed to share too widely. I follow curfews instinctively now, even when nobody's posted one. If I'm traveling and the streets empty early, my body tightens and I head inside without questioning it. Some places aren't dangerous because of what happens there. They're dangerous because of what expects you to know better. And I'm left with the quiet certainty that the curfew wasn't meant to protect the people from something outside, but to protect whatever comes at night from being disturbed. If this stayed with you, share it with someone who prefers grounded horror that feels real. And subscribe, there's another account like this waiting, and it doesn't get easier to tell. Late winter always makes towns feel smaller than they are. Snow narrows the streets, sound doesn't travel, and people move like they're conserving heat and patience. I was 38 and living out of a suitcase again, doing what I'd done for most of my adult life, regional utility compliance audits. Meter records, infrastructure logs, photo documentation, chain of custody forms. The work is dull on purpose. Dull means safe. Dull means nothing is improvising. This town sat in a shallow valley, cupped by wooded hills that held the cold like a lid. Everything was maintained in that practical, municipal way. Plowed streets, salted corners, storefronts lit until closing, street lamps that worked. It felt muted but functional, like it was saving energy for something more important than being welcoming. If you want more of these quiet, real-style accounts, you can subscribe. This is the kind of story people don't usually say out loud. I rented a small apartment above a closed hardware store. The sign was still up, sun-faded letters, but the windows were papered from the inside like the building was sleeping. My evenings were structured, backup inspection photos, write notes while I still remembered what I'd seen, submit reports, charge gear, repeat. Nothing emotional. Nothing personal. Temporary. The assignment wasn't complicated, just inconvenient. The utility district wanted overnight data collection from 2 substations that logged usage patterns after dark, load shifts, voltage variance, irregular draws that only showed up when the town settled down. They'd had a run of billing inconsistencies, which usually meant human error or failing sensors, not anything dramatic. Still, the request came with a tone that told me they wanted an outsider to sign off on the numbers. The apartment building lobby had one of those bulletin boards that collects the town's nervous energy. Lost keys, church dinner flyers, a typed notice about snow removal. That's where I saw it, laminated, slightly crooked, attached with 2 clean screws like it mattered. A nightly curfew. For residents and visitors alike. What bothered me wasn't the curfew itself. Small towns do weird things and call it tradition. What bothered me was the time. It changed every night. Not by an hour for daylight, not by weather. It drifted, 9:17 one night, 9:22 the next, 9:14 after that, following no pattern I could see. There was no penalty listed. No threat. Just a recommendation to remain indoors. I assumed it was tied to safety. Ice on the roads, past accidents, maybe an old ordinance that never died. My work required late-night data syncing, but I didn't plan on walking around. I could stay inside, awake, and do my job. Curfew or not, I wasn't anyone's problem. The first night I worked past curfew, I was hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table with my inspection camera still damp from the cold. At 9:17 on the dot, the usage graph on my screen spiked so sharply it looked like a glitch, an abrupt jump and draw that didn't match the day's trend at all. At the same moment, outside my window, the streetlights began shutting off in sequence. Not all at once, block by block, like someone was flipping switches in a practiced route. The storefronts across the street darkened. The only light left was what leaked from upstairs windows, thin and private. And then the quiet set in. Snowfall muffles sound, sure, but this was different. It was like the town had gone under a blanket and held its breath. Under that hush was a faint vibration you didn't hear so much as feel. A low, steady hum under everything, like distant machinery running deep below ground. I told myself it was industrial equipment cycling on. A heating plant. A pump station. Something I didn't know about, because I didn't live here. Still, the discrepancy sat wrong. The town went dark, yet the substations showed increased draw. Darkness should mean less, not more. I saved the graph, annotated the time, and tried to ignore the way the building seemed to listen with me. Over the next few nights, the pattern didn't just repeat, it sharpened. The energy spikes only happened during curfew hours. Daytime loads were ordinary, almost boring. Then curfew would hit, whatever odd time it was that night, and the draw would surge as if the whole town had turned something on at once. Not lights. Not heating, not like that. Something heavier. Something that pulled. I started cross-checking with thermal readings from my equipment. I wasn't supposed to be doing thermal mapping, but when you've been in this line of work long enough, you learn to trust your own verification more than someone else's reassurance. The readings showed warmth moving through the streets after curfew, sliding along routes that matched the old storm drains and utility corridors. There were no vehicles, no plows, no late-night trucks, just heat traveling. At the same time, the sounds under my apartment changed from a vague vibration into something rhythmic. Too slow to be pipes, too steady to be wind. It came in pulses like a long inhale, a long exhale, with pauses that felt intentional. My phone clock drifted by a few minutes after curfew. I first noticed because I was syncing timestamps between devices. The laptop would show one time, the phone another, my backup recorder another. I corrected them, thinking it was poor reception. But it happened again the next night. And the next. Always after curfew. Always by minutes, never hours, like time was being nudged rather than broken. In the mornings, the snow outside held long, shallow impressions that weren't footprints. Not tracks either. More like pressure marks, broad, dragged arcs that dipped the surface without cutting into it. The kind of marks you'd see if something heavy passed beneath a thin layer and the weight translated upward. I stopped sleeping well. Not because of nightmares. Because my body kept waking at the same point each night, right as the curfew minute approached, as if it had learned to anticipate the change in the air. The building would creak, not from wind or heat, but from something settling into a slightly different posture. It made me feel small in a way my work usually didn't. By the fifth night, I wasn't just collecting data. I was waiting for the town to do whatever it did when it thought no one was watching. If you're the kind of listener who appreciates slow burn, realistic horror, a quiet like can let me know you want more stories like this. I tried to ground it in paperwork because paperwork is what I trust. One afternoon, I went through the municipal records I'd been given access to, old diagrams, infrastructure maps, engineering notes that dated back decades. The utility district kept archives the way some families keep photo albums, messy, sentimental, full of things no one wanted to throw away. That's when I found the phrase that changed the way I looked at the curfew. Ground stability incident. It was written like a weather event, like a small scandal. It referenced a period when the town had been rebuilt and relocated in sections. Entire blocks shifted uphill, roads relaid, certain areas marked as restricted. The notes mentioned stress cycles in the earth, measured and recorded the way you'd record pressure in a pipe. I overlaid the historical stress cycle times with the curfew schedule I'd been photographing from the lobby sign. They aligned. Not perfectly. There were adjustments over the years, refinements, like the town had learned the rhythm more precisely. But the shape of it was the same. The curfew wasn't about people wandering. It was about minimizing surface disturbance during a cycle the ground went through like a living thing. The thought sat in my chest with a dull weight. Being awake might matter. Being inside might be necessary. Observation itself, movement, light, vibration, could be the wrong kind of signal. I remember staring at my own reflection in the dark laptop screen and thinking, with no drama at all, that the town didn't want to be reminded it was being lived on. The main incident happened on the 7th night, and what I remember most clearly is how ordinary it started. I was mid-sync, watching the data stream into my software, when an alert popped up, critical sensor failure at one of the substations. A hard dropout. No signal. No redundancy. In my line of work, that's not something you ignore. If a sensor fails during an irregular draw, you document the failure in person. You don't leave a gap that someone can explain away later. Curfew that night was 9:19. The alert came at 9:23. For a few seconds, I argued with myself in the quiet kitchen. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the same resistance you feel when your body knows something is off, and your mind tries to keep the schedule anyway. I put on boots, grabbed my field bag, and went downstairs. The lobby was dark. The bulletin board was barely visible. The curfew sign, though, was there, pale in the dim light like it held its own glow. 9:19, already passed. When I opened the front door, the cold hit my face and stole the moisture from my eyes. The street was darker than it should have been. No street lamps. No traffic. No wind. Snowflakes fell straight down like they had nothing to push against. I stepped onto the sidewalk, and my foot sank a fraction deeper than it should have. Not into snow, into something beneath it that gave, then slowly pushed back. The ground felt subtly warm through the sole of my boot. Not heated like a pipe. Warm like skin beneath fabric. I stood still and listened. The low vibration that I'd felt inside was stronger out here. It wasn't loud. It was everywhere. I could feel it in my teeth, in the bones behind my ears, the way you feel a subwoofer in a parked car with the windows closed. Halfway down the block, a manhole cover trembled. It didn't lift. It didn't rattle. It quivered in place as if something below it was brushing past, careful not to disturb the surface too much. My phone screen lit in my hand and immediately dimmed, like the cold was draining it, but the battery was full. The time flickered, 9:24, then 9:23, then 9:25, jumping forward and back by minutes. Behind the phone's glow, I saw the street itself look wrong, not visually but spatially. The distances felt stretched. The hardware store across the street seemed farther away than it had earlier. Not impossible, just off, like I was looking at a familiar room with the furniture moved by a few inches. And then I understood in a way that didn't need language. I was adding disturbance. Heat from my body, pressure from my steps, light from my screen. I was a signal on a surface that wanted to stay quiet. The vibration thickened. It wasn't faster. It was deeper, as if the thing beneath the town had shifted its attention and pressed upward, just enough to test the weight of what was above it. My instinct didn't tell me to run. Running is loud. Running is panic. My instinct told me to retreat, like you back away from a sleeping animal you accidentally woke. I took slow steps back to the door, keeping my weight even, trying not to stamp, trying not to slip. My breath sounded too loud in the scarf over my mouth. When I got inside, I locked the door and stood with my back against it, listening through the building. The readings on my laptop went wild. The draw spiked higher than any previous night, unprecedented levels that made the graph look like a heart monitor during a seizure. The floor under my feet shifted slightly, not like an earthquake, but like a settling. The building adjusted, one long groan traveling through beams and nails, a gentle repositioning, as if the structure was finding a more comfortable place on whatever it rested upon. Then slowly the vibration eased. Nothing broke the surface. No eruption. No cracking pavement. Just the sense, as steady as a hand on the back of your neck, that whatever moved beneath the town had noticed the change above it and decided not to rise any further. I sat at the table until my hands stopped shaking, staring at the quiet cursor blinking on the report I'd been writing, as if waiting for me to pretend this was normal. The next morning, the town looked clean and ordinary again. Snow glittered in the weak sun. Plows had come through before dawn. People moved with their heads down and their collars up, carrying groceries, scraping windshields, living their quiet winter lives. I checked my logs first thing. Everything had reset. Not just the sensor that failed, everything. Timestamp data streams were clean, smoothed, like someone had run a cloth over rough spots. The overnight spikes were still there in the broad sense, but the sharp edges were gone. The moments that mattered most, the sudden leaps, the jitter in the clocks, were absent. Minutes were missing entirely, as if the system had simply skipped them. In the lobby, the laminated curfew sign was gone. When I asked a town official about it later, casual as I could manage, they frowned like I'd mentioned an old rumor. Software drift, they said. Reception issues. Cold weather makes things act up. It wasn't defensive. It was practiced. The kind of dismissal you offer when you're tired of the same question. I finished the assignment early. I didn't request clarification. I didn't push. I packed my gear, submitted the bare minimum, and left the valley while the hills still held their snow. Back in my usual office, with stable internet and clocks that agreed with each other, I tried to convince myself the whole thing had been stress and isolation and late-night paranoia. But the data didn't let me. There were gaps. Whole minutes missing, night after night. Not corrupted, absent. The timestamps jumped cleanly over them like they'd never existed. I ran checks on my own devices. The gaps matched across systems that weren't supposed to sync. I requested satellite imagery through a database I had access to for infrastructure mapping. Over decades, the town's layout showed subtle shifts. Not redevelopment. Not expansion. Tiny relocations, roads bending slightly differently, blocks that seemed to creep uphill by a few feet, like a slow organism adjusting its weight. That's when the final shape of it settled in my mind. The town wasn't avoiding something that came at night. It was settling onto something that rose. And the curfew wasn't a superstition. It was an engineering solution. A communal agreement with the ground. Stay still, stay quiet. Let it pass under you without being reminded you're there. Since then, I've developed a habit I don't talk about. When I'm in unfamiliar places, motels, rentals, small apartments above closed businesses, I don't stay awake late. I don't sit with lights on past midnight. If I wake and the air feels too quiet, I keep still and let my thoughts pass without acting on them. It sounds irrational until you've felt a town go mute on purpose. Some places, I think, are only stable if you don't draw attention to your own weight. The curfew wasn't for safety. It was for balance. And balance, once disturbed, remembers. If this account stayed with you, share it with someone who likes grounded horror told quietly. And subscribe if you want the next one I still haven't fully explained. Early summer is usually when I feel most settled. Long light in the evenings, warm air that makes even a temporary place feel almost permanent. I was in my early 40s then, working remote for a public records digitization contractor. Towns would hire us when their archives were aging faster than their budgets. This river town had a small municipal building with a back room that smelled like paper dust and old glue, and my days were simple. Scan, label, log, repeat. Fragile ledgers. Hand-drawn maps on thinning linen. Ordnance books with cracked spines. I rented a ground floor unit in a duplex a few blocks from the river. Nothing special. Painted cinderblock foundation, tired porch, screens that didn't quite fit their frames. The neighborhood was quiet in a way that felt practiced. Closed shops downtown, sidewalks still swept, porch lights on timers, and almost no children out after dinner. I liked routine, and I kept to myself. I told myself the same thing every time I took these assignments. 3 or 4 weeks, make my copies, keep my head down, leave. If you come back for stories like this, real feeling ones that don't rush to the obvious, you can subscribe and I'll tell you the next account the way it happened. Evenings were domestic and small. A fan in the window. Microwave meals. A notebook for my daily scan totals. The river was close enough that, when the wind was right, I could hear it moving even with the TV on low. It was an ordinary sound, like traffic at a distance. Something you stop noticing until it changes. The municipal building had 2 rooms that mattered. the front office with a clerk who did everything from dog licenses to burial permits, and a records room that looked like it had been assembled from whatever shelves were donated over the last 50 years. My job wasn't to interpret history, just to preserve it. But you can't spend 10 hours a day with old documents without absorbing patterns. That's how I found the clause. It was buried in ordinances that had nothing to do with one another. Fire codes, sanitation rules, regulations about fishing from public docks. Always the same line, always copied word for word, as if it had been carved into the town's habits. A night curfew during unscheduled conditions. No definition for what those conditions were. No dates, no triggers, no authority listed beyond the town itself. And it wasn't a one-off. The wording appeared across decades, through different mayors, different handwriting, different typewriters. I asked about it once in the casual way you ask about a local oddity. You expect to have a mundane answer. The clerk didn't look up from her screen. She just said, "We close up early." Like that explained everything. Later, when I went to buy groceries around 8, the checkout lights were already dimmed, and a teenage employee was stacking baskets as if it was midnight. I assumed it was a flood thing, or an old crime wave people didn't like to talk about. Either way, it didn't apply to me. My work was indoors, my unit had deadbolts, and I wasn't there to socialize. The clause felt like an outdated warning sign, something kept up for tradition, not because it was still needed. That's what I believed, right up until the first night I stayed awake past it. The curfew time wasn't posted anywhere obvious. I only learned it by watching the town. The diner stopped seating people. The last bar's neon went dark. Porch lights clicked on across the street, and then the street itself seemed to empty, as if everyone had agreed to step back from the world. That first night, I was behind on my scan totals. A brittle ledger had slowed me down, and I'd spent too long recentering pages and cleaning dust off the glass. I brought the work home, just metadata entries, nothing classified, planning to finish and send my report before bed. Around the time the town usually went still, the river sounded different. Not louder, not higher. It didn't swell like floodwater or churn like a storm. It slowed. That's the only word that fits. The steady shush of moving water thickened into something deliberate, like the current was being pulled through heavy syrup. Then the insects went quiet. Summer nights near water are never silent. Even with the windows closed, you hear the buzz and chirr of things you can't see. But it dropped out all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The air at the open window felt heavier, not colder, dense, as if it had absorbed moisture and wasn't letting it go. I stood there in my socks, looking toward the river through the screen. The surface was mostly hidden by trees, but I could see enough of it to catch reflections. That's what caught my attention, faint, pale shapes in the water that didn't match any nearby lights. Not porch bulbs, not street lamps, not the moon. When I blinked, they seemed to rearrange themselves. I shut the window and told myself I was tired. Humidity plays tricks. Fatigue makes patterns out of nothing. I went back to my laptop, finished the entries, and eventually fell asleep in my chair. At sunrise, the river sounded normal again. The insects came back like they'd never left. I laughed at myself quietly, the way you do when you realize you've spooked yourself over something harmless. I didn't mention it to anyone. There was nothing to mention. The next night I was awake again, and I noticed the change before I even looked at the clock. The town's quiet wasn't just a lack of people. It felt like something had been cleared away, like sound itself had been asked to leave. Fog formed fast near the river. Not the slow, natural kind that creeps along when the temperature drops. This was low and immediate, a flat layer that appeared as if poured. It didn't drift so much as settle. When I opened the front door and looked down the street, the fog was concentrated in one direction, the direction of water, like it had a boundary. The following morning, I found a piece of debris in the grass by the duplex steps, a waterlogged plank with a rusted nail still in it, like it had come off an old dock. The river was several blocks away. There hadn't been a storm. It didn't make sense for it to be there. I started noticing small shifts around the riverbank in the evenings, when I'd walk during daylight. A trash can turned slightly, lid crooked. A bench that had been aligned with the path now angled a few degrees toward the water. No proof, nothing dramatic, just enough to make me pause and think, didn't that used to be different? At work, the documents changed on me too, not physically but in what they revealed. I began to see the phrase night losses in flood records and maintenance logs. It was written the way accountants record damage. Missing equipment, missing sections of fence, missing livestock, as if items had been subtracted from inventory. Sometimes the note was stranger, structure absent. Not destroyed. Not washed away. Absent. There were no accompanying police reports. No insurance claims. No outrage in the town minutes. Just bland notations, and then a return to normal. I tried to treat it like a historical quirk. Maybe the town had a habit of filing things under euphemisms. Maybe night losses meant theft. Maybe unscheduled conditions was code for drunken vandalism in some forgotten decade. But the longer I sat with those words, the less they read like gossip. They read like a system. Something formal enough to be repeated. Something old enough to be accepted. And whenever I found myself near the river after dark, even just standing on the porch, looking down the street, I had that same sensation I'd had the first night. Not fear, exactly. More like being observed by something that didn't need eyes. It wasn't the kind of feeling that makes you run. It was the kind that makes you behave. I began shutting my windows earlier. I stopped taking calls on the porch after dusk. I started planning my evenings around the town's quiet, not because anyone told me to, but because I felt stupidly exposed when I didn't. A few days later I was digitizing flood records, thick binders of dates, water levels, damage reports, and hand-drawn diagrams of where the river had breached its banks. It was tedious work, the kind where your eyes slide over columns until you force yourself to focus. That's when I noticed the gap. The river had a long history of flooding, but in every record I handled, the actual flood peak never occurred during curfew hours. Damage happened before, or it happened after. You'd see water rising at dusk, then nothing recorded during the hours the town went quiet, then a damage assessment logged at first light. Sometimes the notes even emphasized it. No activity recorded overnight. As if it mattered to say it out loud. At first I thought it was just because no one was out to observe. But then I saw instances where sensors had been installed, simple level gauges, and even those showed the same pattern. Activity on either side of the curfew, but a strange steadiness during it, like the river held itself in check. That's when the thought formed, slow and unwelcome. The curfew wasn't there to protect people from the river. It was there to protect the river from people. Or maybe more accurately, to give the river time to do what it needed to do without witnesses. To correct itself. To take back what had wandered too close. If you're the kind of listener who appreciates a slow, realistic build like this, a quiet like helps more than you think. Once I had that thought, everything I'd dismissed as coincidence tightened into a single shape. The copied clause. The early closures. The calm way the clerk had answered me. The night losses recorded without outrage. None of it was panic. It was procedure. The night it happened, I'd been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling fan as it pushed warm air in circles. My unit felt too still. Even the refrigerator's hum sounded louder than usual, because there was nothing else under it. Not the usual insects, not the distant river hush. I checked the time and realized I was already past the curfew without meaning to be. That should have been enough to make me roll over and force sleep. Instead, I felt restless in a way that didn't match my exhaustion. I told myself I just needed air. I stepped onto the porch in bare feet, careful not to make noise like the sound might matter. The boards under me were warm from the day, but the air had turned dense again, damp in my lungs. The street was empty. Porch lights glowed behind screens like sealed aquariums. No cars. No voices. No dogs. Down the street, the river's presence felt closer than it should have. Not by distance, by attention. The surface, where I could see it through the trees, was smooth in a way water shouldn't be. Not like ice. Like a held breath. The fog sat low, thickest in that direction, as if the night itself was leaning toward it. And then I felt the pull. It wasn't physical. My feet didn't slide. My body didn't tip forward. It was a directional pressure in my thoughts, like an idea being planted. Look. Step closer. Just to the end of the walk. As if something had noticed my presence and had decided to include me in its focus. I gripped the porch railing, not because I was about to fall, but because I needed an anchor to something ordinary. Painted wood, rough and chipped under my fingers. The waterline began to inch closer. Not rushing, not spilling, not flowing like a flood. It simply advanced, a dark edge moving with purpose. The grass between the trees and the river looked damp, then darker, then wet, as if the river's reach was being extended without motion. In the smooth surface, reflections sharpened. At first they were just light shapes, the way my eyes had caught them before. Then they began to resemble outlines, as if the water was practicing the idea of form. A suggestion of shoulders. A suggestion of a head. Not faces. Not features, just shapes that felt almost human in the way mannequins do, close enough to make your skin revolt. I realized, with a sudden clarity that had nothing to do with logic, that it wasn't trying to show me something. It was trying to make something that could meet my gaze. My throat tightened. I whispered without thinking. No, the word came out small, swallowed by the wet air. I backed into the doorway and shut the door too hard. The deadbolt slid home with a loud click that sounded wrong in the quiet. Inside, I turned off every light and stood in the dark, facing the window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself from watching the curtain move slightly with the fan's draft. I waited for footsteps on the porch, for a knock, for anything that would make the situation familiar. Nothing came, but the pressure remained, like a mind held close to the glass. Not anger, not hunger, something more neutral and final, like a hand poised over a ledger, deciding what belonged. I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall until the first gray light showed under the blinds. At sunrise, sound returned abruptly. Birds. Distant traffic. The normal world resuming its script. When I stepped outside, the porch boards closest to the river were warped inward. Not swollen upward from moisture, but bent toward the water, as if they'd been pressed from above by something heavy that leaned in that direction and stayed there for hours. The wood held the shape like memory. That morning, the town looked exactly the way it always had. People drove to work. The diner opened. The clerk in the municipal building greeted me with the same neutral politeness. No one looked tired. No one looked afraid. No one acted like anything had happened overnight. I wanted to ask someone, anyone, if the river had done something unusual, if the fog had been thicker than normal, if they'd heard the insects go silent, but I couldn't find a way to ask without sounding unstable. So I didn't. I went into the records room, set up my scanner, and forced myself through the day. My hands shook slightly when I aligned pages. I caught myself glancing toward the window, even though the river wasn't visible from there. Every time I saw the phrase unscheduled conditions, my stomach tightened. By the end of the week, I had enough scans to justify closing the project early. I packaged the remaining ledgers carefully, left clear instructions for whoever would finish later, and emailed my supervisor that I'd be returning ahead of schedule due to housing issues. It was technically true. I didn't elaborate. When I loaded my car, the duplex next door had a fresh for rent sign in the window, like it had been waiting. On my last drive out, the river ran alongside the road for a short stretch. In daylight it looked ordinary. Brown-green water, sunlight on ripples, trees reflected cleanly. It looked like something harmless that had never once considered me. Weeks later, back home, the job became data management, renaming files, uploading backups, cross-checking index sheets. That was the comfort of it, screens, folders, predictable systems, until I opened a batch from the river town and found blank pages. Not missing files. Not corrupt uploads. The files existed. The names were correct. The timestamps matched the day I'd scanned them. But when I opened them, the images were white, as if the scanner had captured nothing but light. I checked my original logs. Those pages had scanned cleanly. I remembered them. Some had distinctive stains, odd margins, handwritten notes in the corners. I could picture them the way you picture a room you've been in too many times. Now they were empty. I thought maybe I'd made an error in export settings. I checked everything. The blanks weren't random. They clustered around the same content. Ordnance pages with the curfew clause. Flood records that referenced night losses. Minutes from meetings where the town discussed river maintenance without ever naming what they were actually maintaining. The missing years lined up like someone had taken a careful finger and slid it through the archive, lifting out only what mattered. It wasn't just taking objects. It was taking records. It was making sure the story couldn't be told cleanly, even by someone who had tried to preserve it. I don't live near that town. I haven't driven through it again. But the river changed the way I think about boundaries. People like to believe rules exist to prevent disasters. We put up fences, post signs, enforce curfews, and call it safety. But sometimes the rule isn't a barrier. Sometimes it's an agreement. A way of stepping back and letting something older do what it's going to do, without challenge and without witness. I don't stand near rivers at night anymore. Not because I expect to see shapes in the water, or hear insects go silent, but because I learned how quickly the world can become quiet, and how easily you can be noticed inside that quiet. The curfew was never about fear. It was about permission. If this account stayed with you, share it with someone who likes grounded horror that doesn't need to shout, And subscribe if you want the next one told the same way, quietly, and as true as I can make it.